things that are going on. But for this session, we're looking at the history of AI, and we're focusing on a particular era of that history that involved two institutions in the 1970s, the Slade School and Leicester Polytechnic, which is now De Montfort University. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hand over to Catherine Mason, who's going to be our chair for this session, and I think she will probably introduce the speakers. We are running in a sort of chat mode, so everybody who's not speaking, make sure their microphones are muted, just so that we don't have any risk of weird things happening. Okay, so over to you, Catherine.
Hello, hi, thank you very much, Sean. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm sorry I have got, I'm recovering from a little cold, so my throat is very croaky at the moment, so I apologize for that. Welcome to everybody. Thank you very much for being here. I'm going to try and move this down, this show. How do you want me to move along here? Well, GPT-4 has just come out, and there are various image generators such as Midjourney and many others already out there. And this has become a very big deal for the creative industries. And the legal ramifications have already started going through the courts. In fact, there's issues of consent and copyright that are very concerning. Now, AI is a very loose term, but for me, it heralds a world populated by programs that seem to us intelligent and that shape or guide our lives. One thing is for sure, whatever is coming, it is coming fast. And you can see here that Sundar Pichai is the chief executive of Google, speaking at the World Economic Forum in 2018, and said that AI is probably the most important thing humanity has ever worked on. And this was, in fact, a few years ago. This is 2018. Well, AI is unregulated, at least at present, and there is no plan worldwide for how to deal with this. And it's also very corporate. There's a race for dominance between companies, and worryingly, it tends to take place behind closed doors. We, the public, have no access to it, and we can't see inside the black box. It's also being run by people we don't know and whose values we don't necessarily subscribe to. And that these are things that can control us in ways that we don't necessarily want. But what does all of this mean for the arts? Well, humanity needs to accelerate our adaptation to these technologies. And here's where I think that the arts can have a very great role to play. And today we're going to look at some artists who are innovators and who were considering these concepts way back in the 1970s. I'm hoping that by looking again at this history, we can gain some insight, which we can apply today to AI as it grows ever more powerful. Well, the Computer Arts Society has been exploring these questions for many years. In fact, today, the 29th of March, marks the anniversary of Event 1, which was the first public exhibition held by CAS. And this was the first time that a computer entered the Royal College of Art. It was a PDP-7 and had visual display unit, and it was borrowed from Imperial College down the road and transported to the Royal College on the back of a truck. And over the course of Event 1, the artists there used it to drive their art. And you can see that Gustav Metzger, when writing about this, called it nothing less than a revolution in the British art world. Well, long before Google announced its Bard, which was just announced recently, there was Robin Shirley's poetry generation program that he invented and named Bard in 1968, written in Algol for Surrey University's mainframe computer. Now, Robin Shirley saw Bard not as a labor-saving device, nor as an attempt to replace human poets. Instead, he said, and I quote, "They modify the poet's attitude to their material and make available alternative modes of working." So to paraphrase Ernest Edmonds, they amplify the artist rather than supersede him or her. Another early member of CAS was Edward Ignatovich, whom you'll hear more about tonight. In 1973, he was made an honorary member of CAS, and he wrote an early article about AI in Page. You can read this online by going to the Computer Arts Society's website. And it's a very interesting early example of artists considering this concept. But why did the Slade and Leicester Polytechnic become places where early AI art took hold? Well, during the post-war period and throughout the 70s, art schools were places where innovation and experimentation were taking place. And this was largely thanks to groups of gifted artists who taught here. And they often taught part-time whilst maintaining their own practice. Before computing, there was a great wealth of conceptual thinking. And at the Slade, a pioneering program of computer use in art was instigated by Malcolm Hughes. And he arrived at the Slade in 1973 and found a place that was already welcoming to this idea. Hughes was one of the founder members of the systems group. And putting this very, very simply, it means that he used a mathematical set of rules, a system of his own devising to create work, in this case, mostly painting, as you can see here. Now, Hughes believed that artists could be scientists too, and this notion is very much in keeping with the tradition of constructivism, within which Hughes saw his own work. Another artist associated with the Slade at this time was Jean Spencer, again a founder member of the systems group, and she happened to be Hughes' wife. She was interested in the way that information is handled and transformed in art. Also at the Slade was Harold Cohen, who'd been teaching part-time there since 1962, and he brought an intellectualization of abstract art. He linked abstraction with rigorous thinking. Now, this was obviously before his move to Stanford and the creation of Aaron. His brother, Bernard Cohen, had also been teaching there since 1969, and it was Bernard Cohen who first mooted the idea at the Slade to embrace the new field of art and electronics. Now, although these artists did not use computers, this rule-based mindset was very useful for postgraduate art students who wished to embrace computing, and they wrote algorithms to do so. Now, the department was named various terms over the years, called different things, including the experimental department, the Department of Experimental and Electronic Art, EXP, experimental media, experimental and computing, and so on. And I think that the change of names and the use of different terminology, which seems to be quite interchangeable throughout the decade of the 70s, really demonstrates the difficulty at this time of naming something that was so new and so radical in its remit that they were never really sure what to call it, and they kept adjusting the name over the decades. However, the fact remained that it allowed art students like Stephen Scribner to use computing equipment for the very first time. And he was the first student to do computer work at the Slade starting in 1972. This was before Hughes had even managed to get the department fully up and running. So what we are looking at here is the beginnings of a new art form, one that uses emergent technology to consider what kind of role art can have and how it can contribute to humanity in a post-industrial age. Now, various artists passed through this department, including Daryl Viner, Julian Sullivan, Carol Gray, Nigel Johnson, and this is now a roll call of important early activity in this area in the UK. Julian Sullivan, whom you can see here, came to the Slade from Hornsey School of Art in 1974, and he had a great influence on shaping the experimental department. After graduation, he stayed on as a technician and later became a lecturer. This is his work Entropy, which was an interactive animated work run on hardware built by the artist himself. And you can see his machine down there in the lower right of your screen. Towards the end of his time at the Slade, Sullivan invented an absolutely crucial piece of equipment that he called the ANCAM system. And this allowed students to output work from the CRT. As generative work at this time was different every time it was run, it was very difficult for artists to actually preserve any recording of their piece. So Sullivan devised this movie camera setup, which took photographs and ran them together to make a 16mm film. Sadly, Julian Sullivan died prematurely in 1983 before he could actually make this ANCAM system commercially available. But several artists there took advantage of his system. One of whom was Carol Gray. Carol came from a constructivist background, having worked with Terry Pope, a pioneer of interdisciplinary practice at Reading University. And hers is a good example of so-called constructivist learning, which is in fact learning by doing research through art practice. She wrote in Fortran, and she produced this animated work entitled Wave, using the mainframe and output onto reel-to-reel videotape. And you can see 4 stills from it here. Nigel Johnson came from a sculptural background at Liverpool Polytechnic, where he experimented with electronics. And at the Slade, he produced self-generating art using the Data General Computer. And here you can see a work that traces the movement of a hypothetical living cell in an ideal situation within a changing environment. This was inspired, as were many of these artists at the time at the Slade, by Paul Klee's famous "Taking a Line for a Walk" from his pedagogical notebooks. And this is actually about the act and process of drawing in real time. Now, this work only existed on the screen, the CRT, and it was different every time it was run. So this made output difficult and frustrating. And initially, the only way he had of capturing the work was to photograph the screen using a single lens reflex camera to create a 35mm slide. And in fact, these images here that I have been taken from slides. But eventually, he was able to use Julian Sullivan's ANCAM system, which had been developed precisely for these types of applications, so that you could output something and then have it that you could preserve. So all of these artists wrote their own code, and they were particularly interested in the development of cellular automata, artificial life. And we will hear more about this from Paul Brown and Stephen Bell later in this session, who worked at the Slade. Now, I should just say here that there is a whole backstory of how we got to this stage, going back right to the 1950s and the educational development of basic design that can be traced through the work of Victor Passmore, Richard Hamilton, Roy Ascot, and many others. And this is a foundation based on the science of cybernetics. Now, sadly, I haven't got time to go into cybernetics here, but if you are interested, you can read more about it in my book. So we're going to start, first of all, by hearing from Ernest Edmonds and the pioneering projects that he instigated at Leicester Polytechnic. Now, the Polytechnic culture in the UK during this period is quite unique in that it allowed for cross-disciplinary fertilization and collaboration, collaborative working. And this is because various art schools of art and colleges of technology, which had previously been separate, were now amalgamated into one facility. Thus, people from both sides of what we might think of as the art-science divide could come together under one administrative umbrella, that of the Polytechnic. So I'm going to hand over now to Ernest Edmonds, who will tell us about the various projects that he instigated at Leicester Polytechnic. Stop sharing this. I'm going to hand over to you, Ernest. You just need to unmute yourself, please. You're lovely.
I'm a very silly mistake. Yes, I have unmuted myself. Okay, thank you. Yeah, so now I've got a video. I seem to be seeing a slide from someone.
Do you want to do share screen?
I'm going to share my screen, okay?
Yeah. Perfect.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to give a personal view of the Leicester Polytechnic stuff in the early days. So it's a little bit prejudiced towards myself, but anyway. So for me, it started with me making this relief around about 1968. It was an interesting exercise that led to amazing results to me. Perhaps the most important thing was that I wrote a computer program to help me decide on the final analysis of the piece. What I did doesn't matter in detail, but I was working on it and I decided that I wanted to spray the paint rather than paint it with a brush. Now, I was actually at the Leicester College of Technology, and I walked across the street to Leicester's College of Art and said, is there anyone here who has a spray booth? And I was introduced to Stroud Cornock, who you see on the screen now. And so he helped me do this because he was an expert on that matter. But our relationship wasn't really about spraying paint at all. It was because he realized, as I discussed the work with him, that I'd written a computer program to make it. And Stroud, who, like me, arrived in Leicester at about that time, had come from working with Roy Ascot and was setting up a media centre within fine art. He was employed as a sculptor, but he tried to progress the use of different media, and the computer was one of those things that really excited him. So we got going in a very exciting way. And it was the same year that cybernetic serendipity was shown in London. One of the things here is Sam by Edward Inatovich, who will crop up a few more times in my talk. So I use that as an illustration of that particular exhibition, which shows what an exciting time it was. Stroud was very active in promoting new ideas. And in 1970, he also put on this exhibition called The Invention of Problems. Very interesting title, if you think about it, because one of the things that is clear about creativity is that it's not really about solving problems. It's much more about defining what the problem is. And I could say much more about that, but I'll skip it. So a very interesting title. And he wrote a short note at the front of this catalogue, where he said that we were moving from the notion of the machine as a task-performing device to man-machine systems. And I must tell you that although nowadays we talk about human-computer systems, back in those days, man-computer was the normal phrase. This was the notion of moving from the machine as a tool to the machine as a medium. And the other thing that was really important here was the collaboration between artists and technologists. Here's that work of mine that I showed you in the exhibition there. In the same year, the Computer Arts Society had an important role within this conference and exhibition. And Stroud and I worked on that. But I would like to mention that it seemed to me to be a very strong opening up of the connections between artists working with this new media. So Manfred Moore, first of all, showed his computer-based work there. This was the first time that he showed it in an exhibition. Frida Narka talked about his work in the conference part. Gustav Metzger both showed in the exhibition and talked in the conference. And Stroud and I worked there too. We worked on an interactive art piece because we were really saying that interactive art will be the future. Stroud is on the telephone there, and that's me standing looking at him. This was the piece we made. I'm not going to describe it because there isn't time, but it was an interactive art piece using a teletype and a graph plotter, used to illustrate what interactive art could be. And in the symposium itself, we presented this paper, The Creative Process, where the artist is either amplified or superseded by the computer. And this was kind of like a manifesto that set the thing going at Leicester Polytechnic at that time. We also talked to the Computer Arts Society. We were developing software packages for artists. We had a group which we called the Combined Study Group, again, across disciplines. And so it was very lively. And at this time, Leicester Polytechnic was formed, so our two institutions were brought together. And people from both sides of the art and technology divide worked together. And then, so the next year, Stroud organised the second invention of problems. And this was really interesting because we brought together a lot of people who were very imaginative and very much exploring the future that lay before us. Gavin Bryars, the composer, John Lifton, Joe Tilson, Edward Inatovich, I've already mentioned, and Stephen Willets. So these people came together at Leicester Polytechnic, sharing their ideas and promoting their different views of the future. My contribution was partly in the exhibition where I put up my first networked art piece. And so it's hard to think about it today, but this is before the World Wide Web, pretty much before the internet. But it was nevertheless the whole notion of networked art was what I was looking at. Stephen Willets, very important figure still today, and certainly then, put on an exhibition the next year in Nottingham called Cognition and Control. And he invited Stroud and myself to participate in this. So this was a very valuable move forward. So we were not just working within the Polytechnic, we were spreading out. A few things happened next, and let me just mention a couple that matter. First of all, I was actually working in the computing department. In fact, I started to run it. And I was given a research studentship that I was able to allocate to someone who could do a PhD in computing. And of course, it's maybe not surprising, but I thought, well, can't I give this to someone who could look into computing and art? I rang the funding body and got their agreement that this was okay, because it maybe would have been thought to be a bit peculiar at the time. And then I talked to Stroud, and he told me about Stephen Scrivener, who'd been around in what was then Leicester Polytechnic, but had moved to the Slade. We'll hear more about the Slade later from others. And Stephen came to do a PhD with us.
Trying to get it with the sounds on this.
And many other things happened then. Because Stephen was at the Slade, I went there. I met Malcolm Hughes, who you've already heard about. Malcolm was an important figure in the systems group. And it turned out that two other important people, Susan Tebby and Colin Jones, worked at Leicester Polytechnic. So there was a very strong relationship there between us. And we developed a very good relationship between myself and others at Leicester Polytechnic and the Slade through Malcolm. I would say that although he, for most of his life anyway, didn't use computers, he and others in the systems group were very interested in this development in the future. And he said to me that what we were doing at Leicester Polytechnic, the whole scene at Leicester Polytechnic, was, I quote, the future. So this was an important step forward informing that relationship, and the systems group in general, who were doing things that led into a lot of the software art that followed, was very important and was very much encouraged by the Slade anyway, but more of that later. A couple of other things I want to just say before I finish is that maybe this was one of the first meetings discussing art and AI in 1976. We held this meeting at Leicester Polytechnic. AI people like Maggie Bowden and Robin Poppleston came. People came from the Royal College of Art, Brian Reffin-Smith, for example. And Edward Inartovich gave a talk here describing his understanding of how robots might work and what the real research issues were from an artist's point of view, but actually, as the other people who were at this meeting will confirm, I'm sure, contributing to AI. So this was, I think, a very important step that we made. Then we formed what was called the Human Computer Interface Research Unit. Steve Scrivener and a couple of other people and I got a very large grant. It would, in today's money, it would be worth about £4.5 million to look at human-computer interaction. I felt at the time that although interaction was the future in art, we didn't understand it. And we needed research. This drove a kind of research agenda to try to understand more about how people interact with machines. And this project did this. And our sadly lost Dominic Borum was one of the people who joined us at that time. And in the context of Computer Art Society, worth remembering that he took over running Page from Leicester at that time and made a very valuable contribution both to our work and to the whole community. And then, for various reasons that can be missed now, we moved on to Loughborough University. Steve Bell joined us. I'll talk later, so maybe I needn't say more about that, but also someone from the Slade. So the Slade relationship continued there. And the future then became art and research, exploiting the possibilities of this new medium called the computer. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Ernest. That's very, very interesting. And just before I move on, I should have said to everyone, if you want to ask a question, please do put it in the chat down below. That is being moderated by us, and or indeed you can save it until the end and you can do the hand raise, and we'll try and answer some questions, at the end. Okay, but I'm now going to hand over to Stephen Bell, who Ernest just mentioned there. Stephen Bell started our story here with AI at the Slade before moving on to working with Ernest, but I think he's going to tell us all about his work and how he got to the Slade and what he did there. So thank you very much, Stephen.
Hi, okay, I'm going to share my screen so I can show the work that I used, and let's just get this. I did, so get full screen. Yeah, okay, so this is me at the Slade. During the period 1977 to 79, when I was a postgraduate student at the Slade, I wanted to try out media that I hadn't already had the chance to use. Thus, as well as performance, what I called arting at the time, moving around with folding sculptures and using video and closed circuit TV installations, which I hadn't had a chance to use, where I was at Bristol Polytechnic previously and learned traditional media. The video installation, this is a piece I called Clues, which was a kind of video game where I was the computer. That's more of that on my website. But another new medium I had the opportunity to begin to use was computer graphics programming. In principle, I was still pursuing the idea picked up from the artists like Sol LeWitt, Yoko Ono, Franz Erhard Walter, Kenneth Martin, and the Systems Art Group, like people like Gene Spencer and Malcolm Hughes, that work could be made systematically, following instructions or restrictions. Malcolm Hughes argued that the system used in making his work should be retrievable through analysis of the work, and I rather liked that principle. Initially, I used the shapes of my sculptures in the work and just took them, and these are perspective projected drawings of them done on a plotter. However, I wanted to get away from the geometrical aesthetic associated with constructivism and minimalism that I'd been exploring and felt locked into. Computer graphics came to the rescue because using vector graphics, which is what the plotter worked with, I could use straight lines to make curves. My grasp of computing through the whole period was rather limited compared to fellow student, say Paul Brown, but we shared a lot of ideas. In particular, I remember how we both experimented with anaglyphic plots to try and get three-dimensional imagery. I don't know whether Paul would remember that. Effectively, I had next to no idea how the computer worked at a fundamental level. So had real trouble getting my head around the ideas that Chris Briscoe and Julian Sullivan did their best to explain to me. Nevertheless, over time, I replaced shapes based on my sculptures with cross-hatching. And then, because I could, I got the plotter to draw circles. Then I realized I could also get it to draw helices. And I got the system to vary the dimensions of the helices randomly. While learning how to program at the Slade, I was entertaining lots of ideas, amongst which were the relationship between play and art, as hypothesized by Ellen Disaniake, and importantly, in the context of the discussion of AI in art, the location of authorship and audience participation in the realization of work. One of the ideas that I worked on was a space game that would automatically produce a comic after the game had been played, with highlights automatically chosen by the program. I felt that just as movies and animation had been the new art form of the 20th century, computer games, or an interactive form, something like them, would be the new art form of the 21st. As a teenager, I'd seen Edward Inartovic's Sensor on BBC's Tomorrow's World. To me, it signaled the future, interactive art, but I had a long way to go. I gather Ed and some famous computer artists visited the Slade, but for whatever reasons, I didn't get to meet them. I did, however, spend a splendid afternoon with Ed Inartovic and his wife many years later when I was doing my PhD. The spacecraft in the program would move about in space, and if they got within range of each other, would fight, hence the zap shapes. When they saw what I was trying to do, Julian, I think it was, introduced me to at least one artificial intelligence technique, but I didn't really start using it until it successfully in my art until 1984 to 85, when I was artist in residence at the University of Kent at Canterbury Computing Lab. That technique was the state transition table. I didn't manage to implement it at the Slade because I learned about it late in the course, and as I had to focus on preparing my final show, the space game project was never finished. One of the most important things about being at Slade was that I mixed with students from stage design, life painting, filmmaking, photography, sound design, to name but a few. Also, the number of students, the subjects that the fellow students that we were doing in the experimental lab was really important. from people doing film. There were people like John CAS, who was doing wonderful work where he was consulting a map and then predicting what was going to be seen when he went out and took photographs. As well as fellow students, there were other artists. What was really important, who were using computers. Chris Crabtree would drop in occasionally from the printmaking department, later called John Crabtree. Peter Bales was a resident artist. Daryl Viner would occasionally drop by, and Chris Briscoe, of course, who taught me programming. All made work that had an enormous influence on me. This is one of Chris Crabtree's story pieces. And the idea of the computer could be used to simulate animal behavior, possibly human behavior, generating data that could then be used as a source of art, resonated with my interest in using human behavior in my work. Crabtree produced other prints where the creatures and features in the scene were represented by rectangular geometric patterns, but I haven't been able to find any examples of these. And this is a kind of storyboard. You can see these creatures moved across the screen. They consumed, across the print image. They consumed the vegetation. I think they might have got angry and attacked each other. I'm not absolutely sure, but it certainly inspired me. I love that stuff. When I recently approached Peter Bales for some examples of AI from the time he was at the Slade, he sent me these. And I'll go through a few. In an excerpt from his book, Simple Thoughts, which he recommended to me, he wrote, "The search programs are an early implementation of a virtual agency. 3 agents are positioned at random within a square field of action. A 4th item, at the time I thought of this as my remote presence within this small virtual universe, added by hand at some specific position. The goal of the algorithm is to localize the 4th item." So 3 points are at random and then one that he placed itself. And they then had to trace, they had to find their way to where he pointed. The underpinning notion, as he said, is to collaborate the 3 agents have to collaborate in order to solve the problem successfully. They have to adapt collectively, given a history of consecutive individual actions, and are drawing issues spontaneously from agents tracing their respective trajectories, and are an example of a system documenting itself. Sometimes the search process displays a relatively affirmative outcome. Sometimes the process escalates into an endless search outside the field of action. We appreciate, he says, the consistent aesthetics of an unpredictable system, nevertheless operating in a coherent fashion. Now, Paul's going to talk about Chris Briscoe's work. I just want to mention that his work also influenced my later practice, and just how much you'll see for yourself when I show you a bit of that. Or if you know it already. As far as I know, Chris stopped making his fine art work when he set up shop with Paul to make commercial work at Digital Pictures and built upon his CG anatomical modeling with Primal Pictures. Now, we've already seen a picture from Dominic, and Dominic was a fellow student at the same time as me and Paul. And what Dominic did was exploited the accuracy of the plotter to achieve his goals. In part, he explored the way that we perceive depth cues and figure ground perceptual phenomena. I'm going to show you images from an issue of Page in which he explained his work, but read extracts from a 1992 Leonardo article by Dominic titled "The Conceptual Framework of My Computer-Assisted Drawings, Reflections on Physics, Buddhism, and Transactional Psychology." He explained that his technique was to use the pen plotter to draw an image in 2 stages. First, what he called a field of vertical lines, and we can see one here, and then a second drawing of a matrix of 25 groups of parallel lines. Superimposition, he wrote, of the matrix on the field causes a number of strange things to occur. Perhaps the most striking effect is that where the lines of the matrix coincide with those of the field, they merge and virtually disappear, leaving only a shadow caused by the extra density of ink and the slight blob formed at the beginning and end of each matrix line to betray their pleasant presence. Another prominent feature is the occurrence of interference patterns, which are different in each of the 25 groups forming the matrix. As Ernest has pointed out, sadly, Dominic Borum died recently. A link to his obituary can be found on the Computer Arts Society website. Whereas Dominic exploited the technology's accuracy, I wanted to make it less accurate, and I thought more human. Using a version of Randstack, the code that I showed earlier, I began to make drawings that I felt looked like calligraphy. To add some physical irregularity, and thus I hoped to sense that the image might have been drawn by hand, I used brush pens instead of mapping pens. In some respects, I consider this to be the most innovative thing I did while I was there. Like Dominic, I used overdrawing, but in my case, I was using a CMY color system rather than the standard colored inks being used by other artists. I tried to get accurate overlays, but also liked the effect of slight misalignment and that at a distance, the colors combined. Yet, if you looked closely, you could see the individual component colors. I did have my doubts about using the computer, though, thinking that perhaps I'd just been caught up in the excitement, and immediately after my time at the Slade, when I joined the architect Florian Beigel's research unit at the Poly of North London as a research assistant, I decided to suspend doing any of my own artwork for 3 years of the assistantship and see how I felt after that interval. After my time at Florian's architectural geometry research unit, I was unwaged for a couple of years, and then I was lucky enough to get a post as artist in residence at the computing laboratory of the University of Kent at Canterbury from 1984 to 85. This was when I initiated a 10-year project to explore the viability of interactive computer art, and where I got around to using the state transition table approach to design the behavior of species of agents that I called animals in the series of interactive behavioral programs that I eventually called Small World. So this was how I described the behavior of a species of agent. These were behaviors they could have. These were the conditions that they identified as each individual agent saw the other ones, and they had behaviors they could respond to. That's a larger scale, so you can see more of what's going on. After the residency, I applied to join Ernest Edmonds Research Centre, which I remembered Dominic had joined, in part so I could get funding and access to computer technology to continue the Small World project, but also so I could get a science qualification to balance my art ones. There, I was able to explore the aesthetics of interactive computer art, supervised by Ernest and artist researcher Dr. Susan Tebby, leading to the award of a PhD in 1991 for my thesis, Participatory Art and Computers, identifying, analyzing, and composing the characteristics of participatory art that use computer technology. I also contributed little to the center's part in the ALVI Cooperative Machine Research Program, the results of which I think they're probably quite significant in the current discussion of AI in the computer-human interface. I still use Small World-like programs to make my work. The shapes are still generated by visualizing the movement of very simple agents with animal-like behaviors. And for quite a few years now, that's been bee-like behaviors, as if seeking sources of nectar and pollen together. It's worth pointing out, I've retained an approach that reflects the vector-based aesthetic of my initial programmed work. When possible, I install computers in exhibitions so people can interact with the program directly. So I knew so little at the Slade about computers that I actually spelt computer with an O instead of an E, computer, which I think was because I was thinking of commutators, which I did know about. My point is that I was able to make very successful progress in my art, despite the fact that I thought if my program crashed, smoke would start pouring out of the back of the computer because I had no idea how it worked. So even if it's a black box, you can create some interesting work with it. I'm going to stop sharing now and hand you back. And I'm going to put some links on the chat if anyone's interested in finding out more. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Stephen. That's very interesting. And it's great to see that work by Peter Bales and Chris Crabtree. Fantastic stuff there. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're going to move on now to Paul Brown, who also was at the Slade during this crucial time in the 1970s. And I know that, Paul, you've got a video you want to share with us. Do you want to say anything before you share the video, or do you want to go straight into the video?
Yeah,
we'll go
let's
straight
go
into
the video.
We'll go straight into the video. Okay, thank you, Sean. Please can we go straight into the video?
I first went to art school in 1965 when I was 17, and wasn't particularly happy there. There's been a big revolution in art education. I think we were all a bit confused. And in particular, I would have liked to have worked with projections and environmental works. Happenings were the big thing then. And what I could do was either be a painter, a printmaker, or a sculptor. And I was frustrated. But I persevered with the course, and in 1967 I did the drawing that you can see here at the top of the screen. And I pinned it on the wall. I did it at home, pinned it on the wall, looked at it, and found myself being very impressed by it for a number of reasons. One was I knew that I hadn't derived this from somebody else's work. This wasn't a copy, or it wasn't even influenced by any other artist that I knew of at the time. And so I heard my own voice as an artist for the first time, and as many of you will know, for a creative person, that's a really important moment in your life. And a few weeks after this, I showed it at the annual Crit and talked enthusiastically about it, and afterwards the head of department very kindly said, "Paul, I don't think you're cut out for a career as an artist. You need to look elsewhere." So I dropped out of art school, and it wasn't until about 2 years later when Mary Martin won the John Rawls Prize in Liverpool, where I was living, with this work, Cross. And seeing her work, I realised that I was an artist, because she reassured me that I was working in the right direction. And that was another great moment in my life. And another work I did at that time, which really spelt the way for the future, was this gouache. This is a reconstruction. It's an octagonal tile that's rotated randomly to create a more complex image. And I guess one of the things that came out of this was an interest in using very, very simple elements, but lots of them, not just to make a more complex image, because that goes without saying, but to make something where, if you like, the whole was greater than the sum of the parts, which I would have said in those days. And of course, much later, I discovered the word emergence. So I guess my whole career now, from this point, has been looking at creative artworks that have that potential, that emergent potential, to be more than these simple elements that they're constructed from. Around that time, I saw cybernetic serendipity, and I dropped out of college because there was no future for me as an artist, apparently. And a friend, Jim McRitchie, had set up a light show called Nova Express. I joined him, and we became very successful. We played with all the major elements. And this is one of the glass slides that I made somewhere 1968 maybe, and it was discovered last year under somebody's bed in an almshouse in Rotherhithe in South London, and it still works amazingly. So that's a little blast from the past. And I think the things that I learned from the light show was not to be precious. We were there to entertain an audience. We were making visual artifacts to entertain and things, and that was an important learning for me. The other one that we were including works that had scientific, if you like, technical elements. We were using hydrodynamics, thermodynamics, moire patterns. We were looking at cognition through the use of lenses and moire patterns and so on. And so here's another slide from that time. The importance of chance, just these chance things would happen and you'd adopt them and use them immediately, and this interaction you had with the band in real time. And that was an important part of the learning curve. And through this I met Bill Harp. Bill had founded a community arts centre, I think the first in England, called the Blackie in Liverpool. And he invited Jim and I to move to Liverpool and be artists in residence at the Blackie. And through him, I met Meredith Monk, did lights with her, Frederick Ruski, electronica music at Viva. He knew all of the art and tech people of the day. He knew Nanjun Pike, Pierre Henry, and many of the other pioneers, and he introduced me to many of them. And it was thanks to Bill's mentorship. It was thanks to Bill's mentorship that I made the transition from being kind of a provincial art student to a slightly more cosmopolitan artist, professional artist. The other thing that happened at that time, I might go back, that's a more relevant slide for this bit. Somebody had come back from Amsterdam with some very pure lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, and I took a large dose and had this amazing, profound experience. I was going into my own body, looking at muscles and joints and the mechanics of the body, the blood flow, the fluid flows, etc. And I had models for that. At school, I'd done physics, I'd done mechanics, I'd done hydrodynamics, all of that kind of stuff. But then at one point I got into my nervous system, and I travelled up a nerve to the spinal cord, and then I travelled up the spinal cord and into my brain. I had no model for that. I was just in awe in this huge cavern that was full of all these different frequencies and harmonics that were changing and shifting all the time. And the next thing I remember is waking up the next morning, and I was absolutely certain, without any doubt, that I had to learn about computers. I'd seen them at cybernetic serendipity. I knew they were going to be powerful tools for me to use, but that experience told me that they were essential. I had to engage with computational processes to try and understand this amazing experience I'd had, seeing my own mind from the outside in. And so I went to Liverpool Art School. Catherine talks about this process in her book, A Computer in the Art Room, where as a cost-saving exercise, the government had forced these independent colleges, College of Art, College of Engineering, College of Fashion Textiles, College of Printing, to amalgamate as a single financial entity called a Polytechnic. And the upshot with that was that you could go to art college and then cycle across town to another building, which was the engineering faculty, and asked to get taught how to program computers. And so I took advantage of that. This is very similar to the first computer I ever used. It's an ICL 1900 series. It was the main computer for the university, for the Polytechnic. And remember, these things cost a huge amount of money, millions of pounds, and universities could only afford to have one of them. And now I've got 14 computers in this room. It's hard to think of an entire university with just one computer. And of course, it wasn't very powerful. I think a modern wristwatch is probably more powerful than this entire computer that is here. And a friend called Ken Lowe, a lecturer in the maths department, taught me the program. Now, he'd studied his PhD with Richard Dawkins in Bristol. He was really into cybernetics, and he introduced me to the whole concept of cybernetics. Cyberneticians like Stafford Beer, general systems theory, and so on. Wonderful, wonderful man. And that was batch processing, punch cards, on a computer that looked not dissimilar to this. And the other computer I worked on at the time was in the engineering department, where they had the PDP-8 computer, and that was just an amazing machine. It was 12 bits. You can see actually the 12 switches here. Each one is a bit in the word, and it had 4K of memory and 11 instructions, and it was just a wonderful machine to use. And so I worked with these machines, and this is an early drawing I did. Again, it's one of my better known pieces because it was acquired by Victorian Albert as part of the Patrick Prince collection. And again, this is this idea of they're very simple elements, reused randomly, but there's emergent properties. Things appear out of the image that weren't put there intentionally by me. And the other thing that I completed at Liverpool, thanks to winning a competition, was the Northwest Export Award. This was made for the Confederation of British Industry, and many of their companies, Rolls-Royce Motor Cars, built the actual framework for me. Plessy, the electronic company, did the logic design. And on the left, you can actually see, I actually built that, the electronics, the two circuit boards that drove it. And the three lights at the top that you can see are like a worm, and it can make a decision to go left or right. And as the new one comes on, the old one turns off. So this little worm perambulates around the display, and thanks to a number of random functions, clocks out of phase and stuff like that, it didn't repeat its behavior for going forever without any long-term repetition of its behavior. And this was the first real-time generative artwork that I modeled out of discrete logic. It's, and that was, I think, 1976. I did that. So, 1977, I graduated with a first-class honours degree in sculpture, which was kind of weird because I've never even considered myself as being a sculptor. And one of the tutors I'd had at Liverpool, Dave Saunders, was co-founder of the UK Systems Group with Geoffrey Steele. And he said, look, another member of the Systems Group, Malcolm Hughes, has just set up a computer department at the Slade School of Art, one of the major postgraduate schools in England. Why don't you apply for it? And of course I did. I think 200 of us applied, and 5 got accepted. It was very competitive. And here's the Slade. Oh no, sorry, that's the logic diagram for the Northwest Export Award. And it's one of my best favourite drawings. I really like it. But here's the Slade computer. So here again, it's hard to imagine when we've got things like Raspberry Pis. This is a Raspberry Pi here, a little computer that's so powerful. This had 16K of memory. It originally came with a paper tape. I didn't have an operating system. Later we got the blue box at the bottom, which is a 5 megabyte hard drive, and that cost as much as a house. I needed 4 people to lift it up. Teletype, mechanical keyboard for input-output, the storage oscilloscope on the left for drawing on, and the plotter for your final artwork. So that was the system at the Slade. And this is when I really began. That Slade department was heavily concerned with all of the contemporary scientific theories of what we now call bottom-up artificial intelligence, artificial life. And I began to use cellular automata to interpreting them as graphic entities. And so this is a very early drawing called Life Mods. Have I got a date for it? No, I haven't. It would have been about 78 maybe. And what you see there is 6 frames in a developing animation where this cellular automata is guiding the geometry as it develops. And that's exactly what I do today. So this, in many ways, is one of the strongest templates I've got for the kind of work that I've been doing ever since that point in time, is letting artificial life agents, like cellular automata, generate an artwork on my behalf. And this, you saw the Northwest Export Award. This is my first computational generative artwork. Again, this is, I think, 78. One of the people that was found that I think Catherine may have discussed, Julian Sullivan, a very talented artist and electrical engineer, built a frame store. Frame stores didn't exist at that time. I think there was one in England that Cambridge University had built. And it's 96 by 96 pixels. I mean, today that's about that much of the screen, and it's only black and white. And it was very difficult to program. You had to write an assembler and be very careful of the interrupts that were feeding the display. And so this is Builderita. It's 2 concurrent processors. One is looking for pixels that are off to turn on, and the other one's looking for pixels that are on to turn off. And they both make random walks around the screen as they do that. This piece is included in the latest show at the ECS and is online at the Computer Art Society website if you want to actually see it in motion. So that's the Builderita. And the other thing that was happened at the site, all of us really, most of the people working there were involved in artificial intelligence, artificial life, although artificial life didn't really happen until 10 years later. And I was astonished when in 2000 I went to Sussex University to be artist in residence at one of the biggest artificial life research centres in the world, the Centre for Computational Neuroscience and Robotics. And they knew about what we were doing at the Slade. And this was a time, 2000, when nobody in the art world would remember us. I mean, you know, we'd been written off years ago. And here's these scientists who knew what we were doing and who held us in very high regard as a major taproot of their new scientific discipline. And that was mainly because of Ed Anadovich's work, and I think Ernest's already talked about Ed. He's now recognised in the science world as the pioneer of what's called cognitive interactionism. That is, you understand things by interacting with them. This gets away from the old Cartesian mind-body split, where you're a passive observer and you're observing things. What Ed was saying was you have to interact with these things to understand them properly. And that, of course, is the whole fundamental of the modern AI. The old-fashioned AI, Minsky, Feigenbaum, Mickey, all of those people had this Cartesian split that you wrote these programs that independently sort of become intelligent through having a big database and inference engine and so on. And the early life people were saying, no, that doesn't work. You've got to have embodiment, you've got to have interactionism, and you've got to have a learning system. So things learn to be intelligent, they're not taught to be intelligent. And so this was happening at the Slade. We wouldn't have called it that, but that was essentially what we were doing. And the Slade was just a Computer Art Society, met Russell Square. I got more involved in their program. And we were also close to the art lab, the Russell Street Art Lab, the London Filmmakers Co-op, and Hoppy's Video Fantasy Factory, and I got involved in several of those. So that's my talk so far on my work, but I'd like now to talk about two people we had as visitors at the Slade. This is, of course, Harold Cohen and his program Aaron. Harold was by then in the States in San Diego, but he regularly came back to England to visit relatives, friends, and for other reasons. And every time he visited, he'd come in and spend a few days at the Slade. It was very informal. He wasn't a visiting lecturer on the stage to lecture to us. We'd just sit around and chat. He'd tell us about how Aaron was going. We'd show our work to him and so on. And then we'd head to the pub and have a few beers and carry on the conversation. And at this time, I think there's another... this is what he was drawing with at that time. This is the little turtle he used for drawing. So these drawings were huge. They're on the floor, this turtle triangulated on the floor. At that time, if you read his early publications, Harold claimed that he was creating a general theory of creativity in Aaron. I had a number of, I got to know him really well, and over about a 40-year period I knew him. We had lots of conversations, and those early conversations I really challenged him on that, because what I felt he'd done, which is a great achievement, and this doesn't undermine his achievement at all, was not a general theory of creativity. What he'd managed to do was externalise his own personal creativity into an external agency called Aaron. And that's exactly what he did. And then later in life he came to agree with me, to accept that. And so Aaron still exists. His son Paul can run it. And every time he switches Aaron on, this is 8 years after he died, Aaron will still produce 100% genuine Harold Cohen drawings. And I was very honoured. His last major exhibition was in Rio de Janeiro. There's a huge exhibition in this big department store gallery called O Futura. And it was a four-person show of 4 European pioneers. And as you can see, Ernest is there, Harold's right on the right, Frida Naka on the left, and I was extremely honoured to be a part of that team. I was the fourth artist, and I'm there too. So that was Harold's last exhibition, 2015 in Rio, and the year after he sadly died. And I'd like to finish by showing you a work of Chris Briscoe, who ran the experimental department. He was a very talented artist who sadly gave up making art in the 80s. And here's one of his drawings from that time. Each of the lines that you can see there is mutually dependent on all of the other lines. So before it makes a slight increment in its behaviour, it looks at what all the other lines are doing, and then they all increment at the same time, and that process is repeated. So what you've got here is a deterministic nonlinear system with highly unpredictable, or what we might call chaotic behaviour. Chris did sound pieces where each note was dependent on one of the other notes, and so I'm going to end my talk by showing a little slideshow with hopefully a soundtrack of his to demonstrate and illustrate his work. Thank you.
That's really wonderful, Paul. Thank you very much. It's really nice to hear that computer-generated sound art coming from Chris Briscoe at the end. That's superb. Thank you very much for that.
At my end, there was a lot of bad distortion on the audio. I could hardly hear my own voice at times. I don't know if everybody else experienced that, but maybe, Sean, when we compile the final recording to put online, you could cut in the original video and get the sound improved. I
was going to suggest the same. If maybe you can send me a slightly higher res version, we'll make sure that goes in. Yeah. Back to you, Catherine.
The music at the end was really good, though. You could hear that well. Okay, well, we've got a few questions coming through in the chat, and I'm going to encourage everyone to put any more questions or comments that you'd like to say in the chat. But I just want to kick off by I suppose I could ask. I think maybe I can ask this to you, Paul. I think it struck me that during this time you had a lot of control over the technology. You were able to build things. The Slade constructed their own XY plotter, I believe. You could adjust equipment. You could adapt equipment to suit what you wanted to do. You could really get in there and actually tinker with it. And I'm thinking that nowadays it seems like we can't really get into things so easily. We can't mess around with the workings of it. And I just wonder if you had any thoughts on that in particular.
I think certainly that's true. I interviewed Chris for the CAS project, and he said that the Slade computer was much more like a piece of laboratory equipment than a modern computer. And that's true. I mean, we used to take the boards out and we used to wire up our own hardware onto the pins on the sides of the boards and stuff like that. Modern computers like the MacBook I have here beside me don't really allow you to do that in the same way. And because of this idea of transparency in the operating system, they hide the inner workings. Because when I first learned computing, I actually built gates and switches and realized that computers are incredibly simple things. I mean, all they do is open and close switches. I mean, that's all they do. The thing is, there are an inconceivable amount of switches, and they're opening and closing at inconceivable speeds. And so you have this thing that seems to be very clever, and the whole of the internet and everything is just built on opening and closing a switch. So yes, the sort of commercial computers that you buy now do distance you from that technology. But on the other hand, there's a whole load of really wonderful, cheap computers. This is the Raspberry Pi here. It's actually wired up. I can't pick it up and move it. But that's been specifically designed to allow people to plug stuff in and put their own circuits in and etc. So yes, I think it is possible now using there's other devices, not just the Raspberry Pi. And I think these are intended specifically to encourage young people, school children, to get involved and develop their own stuff. And I think what I would like to see more of is education about the fundamental principles of computing. This idea that, yes, they look to be so sophisticated and so clever, but all they're doing is opening and closing switches. And I'd like to see that brought back into education so people can understand.
Can I just jump in and agree with Paul?
Yes, please.
Very much, because as I said, when I was at the Slade, I hadn't a clue how a computer worked. In fact, I actually referred to, I'd got old children's books on how computers work, which were obviously written in the 50s and had nothing to do with the mini computer we were using. So although I was bootstrapping it on the front by clicking in binary code and pressing enter just to get the thing going, I hadn't a clue why that worked. And it wasn't later until I was actually at Bournemouth, and I suppose that was 89 onwards, and teaching students how to, we designed a course and insisted that the students would learn how the CPU worked, because I really wanted them to understand how simple it was. And if you do, whatever the AI is happening, whatever's happening with AI at the moment, at root, fundamentally, we're still, it's still a von Neumann architecture down there somewhere doing very simple comparisons. And as Paul says, it's just that what people are able to do with it is amazing. Absolutely amazing. But if every person in the world understood how the CPU worked, or okay, they don't work exactly like that now, but you've got an idea of the principles. So when you're dealing with an AI, it's a machine.
Yes, that's very, very interesting. Okay, we've got another question that's come through in the chat. I think this is probably linked to you, Paul, aimed at you. This person says they're very interested in the historical link between psychedelics and computational arts. Would you say that the use of AI in the early years was motivated by a desire to incorporate non-human influence and to challenge concepts of the human?
That's certainly my experience. I'm not too sure how common that experience is in the field. certainly my generation were experimenting with psychedelic drugs and mind-altering drugs and mind-expanding drugs. And for many of us, it had a profound influence on our work, our careers. I guess because I understood my body, but I didn't understand the brain, my perception was that I wanted to learn about computers to understand that particular experience I had with psychedelics. I don't know how much that would have affected other people. I imagine it would have done, that other people would have had similar kind of experiences. And the electronic brain, as Berkeley called it, was the obvious tool to turn to try and comprehend the mind. And of course, a lot of people were I think even in 47, it was McCulloch and Pitts defined this idea of an electronic neural network based on their understanding of how the brain and neurons worked in the brain. But that's really all I can say about that.
Do you have anything you want to add on to that front, Stephen?
Yes, yeah. One of the things it's something I harp on about a lot, to be honest, is once I discovered what happened with computers and the fact that it's based on, everything is based on these binary units, saving code, is I'm convinced that that structure influences everything we do with the machine. The amplification, it amplifies yes/no thinking, either or with that, you know, you're with me or you're against me. I initially thought it was to do with the computer, but it's what it does is it embodies this particular way of human thinking, which is just one way of human thinking. But as we've seen in places around the world at the moment and elsewhere, with the way social media amplifies this either or yes/no thinking, I have a bee in my bonnet that because we're using a technology that's based fundamentally on this, that it affects everything we do with it. So we're using the technology affects how we think, how we make things. That can be very positive, but we have to be aware that there are other ways of thinking than yes, no, 0, 1, either or when we're using this technology. So that's another reason to understand it, is so that you don't get taken in by it and you are aware that this is a human tendency, which I trace back to Paleolithic period, but that's another story, that is being exaggerated by this technology. And there are other ways of thinking. One of the things is, like, artists can think both and all the time. In fact, they can think and. They're not either or. Yeah. And that's why art is so important it's so important that artists use the technology.
Yes, and I think that's so important, why we also understand the history so that we can appreciate that the stuff that's going on today. I think that art has a really strong role to play in this.
Yeah.
If I could come back again on that, then we're entering the era of quantum computing, and the idea of 0, 1, yes, no is going to just disappear very quickly into a situation where a huge number of possibilities are considered in every state of the computer, and that's going to have an amazing influence. I think the changes we're going to see in the computer industry in the next decade are going to be quite remarkable and much faster than what we've seen in the past because of that. And we're going to find much more intelligence emerging. And possibly in that period, seeing the emergence of a fully independent, conscious intelligence within a computational system.
All right, well, we've got a hand raised here. So I've also got one more question in the chat. So I'm just going to go firstly to you, Morgan. You've got your hand raised. I think Sean's, hello, hi, welcome.
Yes, hi, thank you all so much for sharing. I'm an artist, computer artist, so this has been very good for me. And I'm also in an MFA program right now studying computer art. So my question, and I'm actually, everything you said about computers is huge because I have been literally building a PC to be able to train my own databases to make AI art. And it's been a very long process because I didn't learn about computers. So thank you for all that. It was very encouraging that I'm on the right track. All that to say, any recommendations on books that were influential to you or any resources? computer-wise since back in the day. I've just been trying to dig into all the resources. So I just wanted to see if y'all had any books or resources that you'd recommend.
Let me go to Ernest Edmonds. Are you still there, Ernest? What would you recommend as a good book for Morgan to start off with?
Well, I think you will excuse me, but I think the book that Maggie Bowden and I wrote would be a very good start.
Remind us of the title of that, please, Ernest.
It was from fingers to digits, right? And the reason I say it is not because what I said in it, or even what Maggie said in it, bless her, although it was very good, but because it contains interviews with 10 artists talking about their use of software in art. And I think it's a unique source for finding out what the people who actually did it, used the software in making art, thought about that software and their process. So I think, you would excuse me for advertising a book I was involved in, but anyway, that was my answer.
Great.
Thank you so
What about
much.
you, Paul? What book are you going to recommend?
What can I say? I think one book in that, pointing to Ernest again, is a book he produced with Linda, and that again looks at many different artists' experience of how they started to use computers. And I've forgotten its name, so Ernest, remind me of the name of that book.
I think you're probably thinking about interacting art research and the creative practitioner. Would that be the one?
Yeah, could be that one. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
How about you, Steve? Do you have a book that you'd like to recommend?
Well, I can't avoid recommending your own, Catherine. I think.
Oh, thank you.
They do cover a tremendous number of as a foundation of what was going on. They're excellent, and as well as your own critical input, the individual statements by artists and hey, oh, I'm in one. I learned a tremendous amount from reading them myself.
Thank you. That's very kind. Okay, we've got a question. One more in the chat, and I'm going to go to you right after this chat, Patrick. Somebody in the chat says, Paul talked about AI being a combination of embodiment, interactionism, and machine learning. Could you please elaborate on the concept of embodiment, Paul Brown?
Okay, this is
a big question.
This is a field that was very much established by Ed Anadovich back in the 70s. And at that time, Minsky and Papert had produced a book called, I forgot the name of the book, but anyhow, they tried to disprove that bottom-up. Yeah, Saprons, thank you. And Minsky and Papert were basically poo-hooing bottom-up A-life approach. They were saying it was limited, it had a threshold, you could only get to the threshold and you could learn no more. 20-30 years later, they withdrew. But what that meant was that for that whole period of maybe 20 years, it was almost impossible to get funding for bottom-up AI research. And Minsky and the group got the money, and it was all top-down Cartesian. Now, what Ed said to me in the pub probably at the Slade was, he said, machines will never become intelligent until they can interact with their environment. And of course, at that time, that ran completely contrary to the canon of AI that was being proposed by Minsky and others. And that's why he's so admired today by the bottom-up researchers as a great pioneer. So the whole idea with embodiment is that you haven't got a mind inside this body, and the body's kind of subsidiary. It just helps you do things, and the mind is the big thing. Many philosophers and others have pointed out that what you've got is this integration, this embodiment, and what you do and how you do it and physically interact with other people and so on is part of who you are. So I've had this pen for a few months now, and it's indelibly a part of my being because I'm using it on an hourly basis. And that extends to all the tools I've got around me and so on. The way I use the internet to connect to people is all part of who I am and what my intelligence is. And this is the idea of embodiment. And I think that's now an important principle in the bottom-up A-Life approach. Ernest, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think once upon a time, people thought that humanity was defined by the heart. The heart did everything, and that's what mattered. And then a bit later, it was the brain. All right. Both of these notions are completely wrong. It's the total body, the total person in the context of where they are and what they're relating to, and their interaction with the world around them. And so what Paul has just said is completely correct. And the problem has been with this notion that we've had in the last, I don't know, 50, 70 years, that everything could be described in terms of the brain and what goes on inside the brain, ignoring everything else, which is, turns out, if you think about it, to be complete rubbish, actually.
All right, thank you. Now, Patrick, you had a question, so let's get you unmuted. Go ahead and ask your question.
Okay. Actually, this is absolutely fantastic. I met, so many people here have been so influential in my career over the last 30 years. But one thing that's interesting is that I've known Roman Verosco since probably 1994 when I was living in Minneapolis. Now I'm back again after about 25 years, and we still spend some time. And I started plotting. I fell in love with his work in about 1996, and there's some fine points on the code that I think that are very interesting in regards to some of the speeches here, but that's a little bit too far in the weeds. But the one thing is that I started plotting myself in about 2003 and still continue to today. But I think it's very interesting is that if you go out on Instagram, there are a lot of younger artists and such that are using that are doing plotter art and doing generative, I'd say now second or third generation algorithm work. And I think what I wonder is that in the same way that I wrote an essay about sort of like the technical non-necessity of the pixel at about 2000 because of resolution getting up to that point. I'm wondering what these younger generation, in other words, if you're aware of this work, and then what these younger generations are I don't know, exploring or learning, or whether it's through this work, whether it's really considering the notion of computational art, or whether it's more about processes and such, and less about the necessity of the form. I'm wondering if what our colleagues here think about the younger generations who are working with more historical forms like plotting, and what if they're learning something new, or what we can learn from them.
Does anyone want to respond to that? Ernest, you got your hand up. What would you like to say?
I'd respond to that, because artists are usually very concerned about the details of the medium that they're using. I was only reading today about a report about artists using egg yolks to enhance their use of oil paint, what we now call oil paint, in Renaissance times, and that they looked very hard at how to use the medium, right? And it's true today with the current media. Now, Roman, his medium is software, right? But he looks very hard at that software and uses it to develop his work in ways that interest him and me too, by the way. But I think that the thing that you're referring to in terms of younger people today, I was going to mention this earlier in the discussion because it's to do with levels of abstraction. And I think that we are very tempted today to work with quite high levels of abstraction. In other words, software tools that enable us to do stuff, rather than low-level stuff, as in software that enables us to control the grim details. Both are possible, but it's so easy to use the high-level stuff. And the trouble is, if you use high levels of abstraction, you import the assumptions that whoever produced that code had, right? So if you like, the style and the all kinds of stuff about what's produced is defined already by the algorithms that are built into this high-level software. So I mentioned before this book that Margaret Bowden and I wrote with these interviews with people, where what you will see if you look at that is that there is a lot of interest in going deep down, not using high-level abstractions, but going deep down into the system and having deep control over what goes on, which is still possible. The problem maybe is that it's not necessary. You don't have to do that anymore. But I think many artists who care about software as a medium do in fact go down in those details.
I think for me, one of the great things is that however you use the technology, if you're an imaginative person with the right kind of a vision, you can come up with interesting results.
Absolutely.
I think there's a possibility. Some of the stuff I've seen at local art college and of people doing this is what's quite entertaining is when I look at what I did when I first started. If you compare it to say what Vera Molnar was doing, my stuff looks like hers, not because I saw it, but because somehow, and I think this very often, I talked to Susan Tebby said that she'd actually had a startling occasion when she'd done, put some work into an exhibition of the systems group where someone else, I can't remember who it was, had done almost exactly the same piece of work. And it comes from a systematic approach almost, and it's rather exciting to see that. And what's interesting, and you would have seen just how much my work related to Peter's and Chris Briscoe's. I'm very pleased that I carried on doing that kind of work that Chris Briscoe had started in a way. So the technology encourages you to do particular things, but then you go off your own direction. And I think I'd love to see where they go, you know.
May I just respond? Because I'm wanting to agree with you very much, but it's not just the technology, it's the conceptual stuff behind it.
Absolutely.
Because Stephen and I were both in exhibitions recently in Sydney. There's an exhibition of my work and an exhibition of people with whom I've been closely related, including Stephen. And what was interesting was how that work related one to another. Susan Tebby was in it also, for example. This work related one to another, even though the work wasn't necessarily from the same base, but somehow there was some conceptual basis behind it that connected the work together. So I could see work from Sean Clark, from Susan Tebby, from yourself, from Stephen Scribner, you know, and from my own work, and it kind of related together. And I think it wasn't technological; it was more conceptual.
I wouldn't disagree. I think it's a bit of both.
Yeah, very interesting. That's very interesting, Ernest. Thank you. Okay, we've got Jack Tate. You want to say something, Jack?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
We can.
Yeah. One thing that I've noticed isn't been mentioned is the potential of generative art to help understand how art works. And it's a thing of mine, although I have to thank John Sharp and another, the CAS for helping me. But it seems to me that this is something that is a route to go down for the next conference, perhaps, because it seems to me an obvious thing that generative art, because it's doing something away from the artist, can be brought in to help understand how art works. So I'd like to hear anyone's comment about that. Thank you.
And I quickly say, one of the things I started using computers, when I started using them at the Slade, I was trying to work out, like lots of students at art college, we were always asked to justify why we were doing what we were doing and whether it was art or not. And I thought, if I learned how to program a computer, I'd understand human logic, and therefore I'd get an insight into why some work was art and some work wasn't. And I've a funny feeling that I did get an insight into some of human logic, and as I alluded to earlier in terms of it being embodied in the computer, but I don't think the computer necessarily embodies all of the way the human works, but it could, as you say, it could provide insights.
Thank you.
If you look at the work of Harold Cohen, I mean, he made it very clear that he, I forget whether he said it to me personally or I read it, but one way or the other, he made it clear that he got into a dead end with his painting, and he wanted to try to understand better what he was doing and how he should move forward. And he found the computer programming a way of doing that. It took quite a while, but he made a progress in his work through this. And I think if you look more historically, generative art is not really that strange. If you look at Islamic art historically, look at perspective, the use of perspective to generate constructions within which small decisions are made. Okay, we make this little brushstroke here and this one there, but all within the constraints of the perspective rules. And as generative artists, as some of us are, maybe you call us that, that's all we're doing really. So it's carrying on the same kind of tradition, but in a modern context.
Yes,
I'd
in
like
fact-
to add to that, if I could, that artists have always experimented with their media. Giotto is a perfect example of that. But from my own perception of who I am as an artist, I go back to Cézanne, and I see in Cézanne the first modern painter who formally analyzed the act of painting as part of the content of the painting. So Cézanne is saying, there's a scene out there, here's a white canvas here, here's a brush in my hand. What is the appropriate mark to make in order to have a mark on the canvas that represents that artifact out there? And so he is in fact undertaking a formal act of analysis of the painting itself. In fact, he's doing in visual terms what Saussure and Percy were doing, developing semiotics. Seurat and Cézanne were developing a visual semiotic. Now, what happens in the 20th century? The constructivists take that over in a big way. De Stael takes it over. De Stael, from that emerges art concrete. And art concrete is absolutely to do with art that is only concerned with its own formal mechanisms. It has no relationship to anything else in the world. And that's what's picked up by Jeffrey Steele and the Systems Group, who, certainly for me and the people at the Slade, they were a phenomenal influence. Almost all of our visiting lecturers were Systems Group artists at that time. But yeah, that's my comment on that.
So constraints can actually give you something to work against, and rules can actually be very inspiring.
Absolutely, it's just like a frame. To me, it's the same as when you're painting, and Ernest pointing out perspective. I was going to actually mention that as one of my systems that I was already aware of using before I started programming. There are these conventions one works within. Look back at the whole idea of having hierarchies of different sizes of sponsors and religious characters in medieval and pre-Renaissance art. They're all systems that we work within, and then people can be very, very creative. And it probably goes right the way back to Paleolithic cave art, where your restrictions were the amount of light you had and the surface you were working on. And then look at how creative those artists were. Absolutely inspiring.
May I just add something here about constraints, because this is not in art, but I think it's very relevant. research in design has shown that designers often add constraints to the specification that they're given before they try to design the solution to whatever it is, because they seem to want the constraints. It's a positive element in enabling them to design whatever they're designing. So if you specify to an architect that you want a building, blah, 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 and it's very open, the architect is very likely to add constraints in that you haven't mentioned in order to make the whole thing more doable for them.
And in a way, to tie in with possibly the later AI discussions that Computer Arts Society is setting up, when you're describing to an AI in words what you want it to generate, you're giving it constraints.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things we have to remember is that the person setting up the constraints, who are these people? And, you know, to what agenda and who is funding them? You know, are they doing this work? So that's where the, I guess the cynicism, if you like, comes in. Have we got any other questions at this point? Have we got anything coming in from YouTube, Sean, that we need to see?
That was the only question I've seen, and we're actually around about an hour and a half, so it might well be a good time to sort of look to wrap up.
Okay, we're getting some very nice comments in from the chat. Someone says, speaking as someone who grew up in seeing people like you in museums, I was very much influenced to become a computer scientist and an artist who writes code. So that's very nice, isn't it? Fantastic. All right, any last comments or questions that anyone would like to say? I think what we are going to do is send round after this event for all participants a recommendation of the books. We've been asked to do that a couple of times. So we will send you a list of the books that were recommended so that you can do some further research. And I would also encourage you to look at the Computer Arts Society's website, where you can find previous copies of Page, which go right back to 1969, and they're an incredibly useful resource. They're written in an easy to understand way, and it's very, very good. They're all on the site. Yeah. Anyone else? Are we done? What do we think, Sean? I
think that's about it. I think if I can maybe say a few words at the end. I think first of all, though, I need to say a big thank you to you and the artist speakers, Paul, Steve and Ernest. I think that's been a fascinating talk, actually. Evening's talk. Very
thank
good.
You guys very, very much. It's wonderful.
I'd like to thank the audience. Yeah, great audience.
And
we had a very good audience, yes.
Specifically related to this, first of all, I'll make sure that a high-res copy of Paul's contribution goes up online as soon as possible. The video of this session will be on YouTube, possibly, well, actually, definitely this evening. But there are a few other things going on which are very relevant to this. I think I'm going to share a screen, and what I would like to do is just mention a few of the other things that the Computer Arts Society is up to at the moment, because we're sort of reorganizing ourselves, and we're starting to get starting to get a good program together. So I'll quickly show people that. So is my screen now visible?
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So hopefully, well, maybe not hopefully. Hopefully you all know the Computer Arts Society, but if you don't, I think this has been a great introduction. Computer Arts Society has been going for 50 years, and we have a lot of material from that archive up on our website, and there'll be more coming up soon. But just so you know, computerartsociety.com, we currently have an exhibition of Paul Brown's work at the BCS headquarters in Moorgate, London, which is open to the general public. People who are involved in the BCS, British Computer Society, can just wander in and show their membership card. People who want to go and visit the offices just have to register for a free Eventbrite. You'll find it on the website here. But we also have a few other things as well as Paul's exhibition. We have some of Ernest's work on display in Leicester, where I'm based, at the Phoenix Art Centre. Obviously, we've had today's talk. As part of this Leicester show, Ernest will be giving a more sort of personal talk about, we'll be having a conversation about his 50 years of work coming up on the 19th of April. We're going to continue the conversation about AI with our next 2 online talks. So on the 26th of April, we're going to be looking at text and AI. And on 1st of June, we're going to be looking at AI and images. And we also have a talk on AI curating following that. So if you found today interesting, hopefully you'll sign up. You can certainly sign up for the talk AI and text one now. Click on this link, join the Eventbrite. I'll include a link in our follow-up email after this. Then there's the EVA conference happening in London in July. Now, I know not all of you are in the UK, but if you can, you might be interested in coming along to that talk and seeing some talks. But also after the conference, all of the content related to this conference will be available online on the Computer Arts Society YouTube. And then the Computer Arts Society speaker program continues after EVA with a bundle of really exciting talks that you'll be able to sign up for. So go to the Computer Arts Society website and find out more about the future talks that we've got. Now, there are a few questions. People were talking about archival materials and books and so on. Our archive is really going to start growing a lot over the next few months. We have a lot of material that is not yet on the website, including some very unique materials such as Edward Donatovich's personal archive. We have that up here in Leicester, so that would be a fascinating resource, and people have talked about Edward a few times. But we already have, as Catherine mentioned, so this goes in reverse time order, Page, which was the Society's magazine that ran up until 2016, together with information about past speaker programs, research projects, Catherine's Computer Image of the Month articles. And then these are things that are being worked on. We have the materials, they're not online yet. And you can go right up to our recent CAS, fairly recent CAS 50 exhibition, more video interviews, the Event 2 exhibition, the exhibitions we're running, and so on. I'd very much like people to see this as a resource that they can go to and help and do their research into the history of computing and AI in art. And we mustn't forget, again, a little plug for Catherine's book, Computer in the Art Room. You can get it from Amazon now. It's very easy to get hold of. And a book came out at a similar sort of time. Catherine was involved in this as well as Paul, White Heat, Cold Logic. I'd strongly recommend people have a look at those. And what I want to try and do is build up a bit of an online sort of library of recommendations. So the books that we would recommend you have a look at, we'll include some in that outgoing email, but we'll have links to them as well. So if you haven't been here for a while, the Computer Arts Society website is growing very nicely. Just to show Paul's exhibition, includes videos, but you can see the work here and so on. So quite a few, and this looks stunning on the big screens there at BCS. So we have a lot of materials, but the next thing really is our talk in about a month or so, which will continue the AI investigations. Jeff Davis is going to be running that one, and we have some really interesting speakers who know their stuff when it comes to the sort of modern text AI, not just ChatGPT, but similar systems, other systems as well. So unless anybody else has anything else to say, I think maybe we'll wrap up for the evening.
Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for coming. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Sean.
But yeah, I think that's been great. And I look forward to seeing a number of you, or hopefully all of you, next month.
Yes, this is just the beginning of a whole season on AI that the Computer Arts Society is doing. So great. We can continue the conversation.
Great. Thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.